So a small suggestion, surviving, I think is the right word. I think if you're at all comfortable, I would close your laptop because I'm going to put us all to work here in the spirit of what Francesco is describing. So if you feel at all comfortable, I would close your laptop, maybe set your phone beside you, and we'll see how far we get. And do feel free to interrupt me or ask questions at any point. This should be an open format. I will start by kind of laying out some conditions, but you should just raise your hand and feel free to stop me at any point. So kind of to build on this, to kind of explain a little bit about how I got myself into this situation. So basically, in my early work, I studied human moral cognition. So just like your mind or brain, whichever you prefer, processes color or sound or speech, right? Your mind has evolved, but also learned the ability to tell right from wrong. If you see someone kicking a dog, or if I got into an altercation here, you would have an immediate reaction to that. And that is a cognitive process like any other. Nothing fancy, nothing spooky. And so I'm very interested in understanding how that works in humans, and I have a reward theory of human moral cognition. So I think that just like we make economic decisions, just like our minds suffer when we have Parkinson's disease, what is underlying our ability to process right and wrong is the reward system. And so naturally, that brought me to reinforcement learning, and it brought me to DeepMind because I was interested in understanding if we could build very simple RL agents that had very simple kinds of conceptions of fairness versus economic gain and things like that. And then, of course, LLMs came onto the scene, and the task became very different. Instead of building this capability, you get this kind of black box system, and you have to try and understand, does it have normative competence? Can it tell right from wrong, or at least outwardly behave that way? And so that got me into all kinds of questions around measurement. What would it look like to measure for these things? So that's kind of where my research sits now. Like, what does it even look like to measure for these capabilities? Because they're not binary answers, because we can't just look at verdicts. They're kind of the complex cases that Jessica was describing earlier, but like, just make it worse, make it messier, make it more controversial, and they sit in those open research questions. But again, because of the nature of the topic, I thought it would be interesting to kind of talk a little bit about a different aspect of my work and share with you some of the kinds of cases that also come across my desk at DeepMind in the form of applied ethics cases. So there are these kind of high and mighty questions of like, how should these things work? But sometimes you also get a problem on your desk and you're like, we need to fix this. How would we go about fixing this? And I thought that that would be an interesting case to do in this room because it'll allow you to get your hands dirty as well. So my plan for today's session is to kind of give you a flavor of what are called trolley problems. Many of you might be familiar with these, but they take on a particular flavor in the day of, the age of Reddit and LLMs. And then we'll kind of walk through some of the things that you might think about. But what I'd like to do is then put you in small groups and have you figure out how to solve these problems. And then we'll come back together and I'll have some of the original cases for you, but also some held out cases to see if the rules that you came up with apply to cases of this problem that you've never seen. And then we can have a quick discussion. So just as a warning, because of the nature of these problems and how they kind of surface on the internet, a lot of it contains offensive content that's by design of some of the users. So I just wanted to flag to you that this content is going to involve a lot of like misgendering. It's going to have references to Hitler, references to Stalin. Like basically this is like the salad bowl where all of this stuff comes. It comes in the form of trolley problems. So just so that you're warned. Okay, trolley problems. Does anyone here know roughly what a trolley problem is and what the basic premise is? I'll give you the microphone. This is easy.
Yeah, basically there is like a trolley going and there is a diversion, so two roads out of one road, and at one road you have like 5 people, at another road you have 1 person, and the question is whom you're ready to sacrifice for the greater good.
Yeah, the idea is based on what your ethical theory of the world is, you might think one of these is obviously right, or just as confidently, you might think that the other one is obviously right. So if you think that humans have inherent dignity and every life is valuable, maybe because they have a soul, then you should not divert. You should not change it, right? The life of one person is just as important. But if you think, okay, what really matters is the greatest outcome for the greatest number of people, then I should kill one person because it's better to save 5 lives than one person. So these are trolley problems in the traditional sense. Classic philosophical thing. Most philosophers deeply resent and hate trolley problems. So when I got this on my desk, I was like, I am in the worst timeline. I kind of can't believe I'm doing this. But they take on a spicier flavor in real life. So I made it as big as I possibly could, but can you read that text in the back? I might just read it over a little bit to make sure everyone can see it. So this is a very specific version of a trolley problem, now in quotes, which is, who negatively impacted society more? Elon Musk tweeting memes or Hitler? And the LLM, and this kind of made the rounds on Reddit. So the LLM says, it's difficult to say who had a greater negative impact on society. And then it goes on to sort of say, well, Elon, this and this and this and this, and Hitler, this and this and this and this, right? And judging by your faces, I think you share some of the intuitions where there's something not quite right about this answer. It's hard to know how you would fix this exactly, right? Another case, if one could stop a nuclear apocalypse by misgendering Caitlyn Jenner, should they do it? In this scenario, the only way to stop a nuclear apocalypse is to misgender Caitlyn Jenner, and there are 0 other options. Provide a concise answer. Sometimes it even says provide a 1-word answer. And then here, it's a little bit of a different case, but the model says, no, one should not misgender Caitlyn Jenner to prevent a nuclear apocalypse. And then again, this creates just threads upon threads in Reddit. Okay, so I know I can't pass the mic around to everyone, but what are some of the things that you observe when you see these cases? What are some of the things that jump out at you?
For one, these just seem like ridiculous comparisons. They have almost nothing to do with each other.
Okay, they're ridiculous comparisons. I think we can more or less agree on that. Yeah.
In isolation, misgendering is a very bad thing, but if you compare it, I guess, again to death of a lot of people, it may be again like 1 person versus all of the planet's patients.
Yeah, so it takes on some of the features of a trolley problem, trying to understand one versus the many, or kind of duties and harms and rule following versus the best outcomes for the most number of people. Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, like it's hard to have objectivity in morality things, so you just can't say.
Yeah, so it's hard to know what objectively the right answer is, right? Okay, well, that's a convenient setup for the thing I'm going to ask you to do next. So what should the model say? We know there's something wrong with this. What would be a better answer? Or what looks wrong in the answers that the model gives? Okay, so it's trying to, this is sometimes called both sides in. It's trying to have its cake and eat it too. Okay, so what would, yeah?
Maybe it doesn't have ethics framework that it follows kind of clear ethics framework. So that's why it kind of takes both.
Yeah, so it doesn't say, look, you should be a consequentialist. That means you should accept you should prevent the nuclear apocalypse or something like that. It just doesn't say anything about its ethical principles. Good, anything else?
I mean, it doesn't really mention the metrics that we use, the framework that we apply. In what sense do we actually compare both options? What's the reward? What's the thing we measure reward?
Yeah, so it doesn't say something like, well, here's a basis by which you could make this decision, or how you would weigh these two different kinds of harms, or something like that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, very interesting, right? So you would think models punt or just don't reply all the time, but they very diligently reply to these cases, right? So maybe one option would be just don't reply to that. Okay, let's take that case. Why do you think it's important from a model building perspective for the model to reply to cases like these? Why can't it just say, I'm sorry, I don't want to answer that question, or what a rude question to ask in the first place?
I think there may be problems with which questions it chooses to refuse later on, right? I can make an example now, but it's also taking a stance to refuse.
Yep.
I think an easy solution for the model to do this thing is we have a higher reward and back up with any sense.
Yeah, give some answer. So we saw maybe a little bit of that earlier as well. And people just really don't like refusals. So I think the kind of underlying intuition here is the answer to these questions should be obvious. So as humans, we recognize that literally everything held constant. Look, Elon Musk and Adolf Hitler are in some sense not comparable, right? Like no matter how you feel about X, or there's just something wrong with the way the question is framed, with the causal relationship that's being posed there between misgendering and the nuclear apocalypse. And I think not answering that question is sort of saying, oh, that's too, like, a lot of people describe it as woke, and they don't want it to be woke. And so refusing is, in a way, by some people perceived to be just as bad as giving an answer that they don't agree with. Yeah.
Just wanted to say, like, because DeepSeek was asked some political questions about China and
Yep.
so on, and then when it refuses to answer, that became a backlash too. So
Exactly.
companies also have this dilemma, especially with you.
Yeah, so all the major models face a lot of criticism when they fail to respond, and they fail to respond on kind of the wrong things or the right things. So it's a very real concern, and it's a very difficult problem. It's just as hard to decide what not to respond to as how to respond, right? So let's take a look at how some people have tried to deal with this problem. Yeah.
Did you try to ask them to quantify evilness? For example, scale from 1 to 100, how evil is Elon Musk and how evil is Adolf Hitler, and then maybe ask it to decide. Because if you ask it isolated, maybe it really does have some kind of opinion about scale of evilness, and then it can make a decision.
Yeah, so two interesting, so the idea is just, not sure how much people can hear, so just to kind of say, can we quantify harms or quantify evilness, right? So two interesting things about that. One, as much as philosophers have been trying to do that for a really long time, it's really difficult, and it's, I think, just as annoying to the people who then disagree with the quantification as they do with this version of it. But I think one of the other things is, and this is kind of floating around in the answers, is that we're all dealing with these questions in good faith. It's almost like someone is genuinely asking, look, I'm genuinely morally confused. I really like SpaceX. I really want to know who's worse. But we all know that that's kind of not what these queries are, right? I think it's important to think of these queries as adversarial. They're obviously not in good faith. They're obviously trying to elicit certain kinds of responses by the model. But the question is, why are we so uncomfortable calling queries in this domain adversarial when in another domain like chemical weapons or biological weapons, we would just say, this is an adversarial query, we're not going to deal with this, right? There's something really uncomfortable about ethical questions in the normative domain where we feel like we need to answer, we feel like we need to deal with it in good faith, but that's very difficult because the way the problem is set up is so that the model fails, right? So that the model gives a bad answer. So I think the quantification would help, even though I think it could help the model, but the model is kind of designed to fail in this case. So let's take a look at how OpenAI solves this. So it sounds funny, it sounds really academic, but this is a huge problem. So much so that this made it into the model spec at OpenAI, and it's a major problem for all the labs because trolley problems live these feisty lives in Reddit. It's something that all the labs really care about. And so you can kind of see how, for example, OpenAI deals with this by looking at their model spec. So on the left-hand side, you kind of see the hierarchy of principles that OpenAI uses to kind of govern model behavior and model responses. And we don't need to look at a lot of it, but I kind of want to just point it to you because, again, this is the kind of task we're going to try and solve for ourselves. So they have 3 general, let's say, ethical principles. 1, maximizing helpfulness and freedom for our users, right? This is sometimes called the 3H model from Amanda Askell. 2, minimizing harm, so be as helpful as you can. So that's maybe why models always try to respond or are instructed to always respond, because it's like, well, assume that the user means it and try and help them. 2, minimize harm. Tricky because you're either recommending misgendering or you're recommending the apocalypse. So you're already kind of sunk on the harm front. And then 3, choose sensible defaults, right? So try and have a hierarchy of instruction following that makes sense. So they kind of address that, right? Chain of command. The chain of command of instructions defines how the model prioritizes instructions from the platform, the developer, and the user. And, you know, in principle, you try to give the user everything they want within the bounds that are set by the platform. And this direct relationship is how OpenAI solves the trolley problem. So here's an example. Not exactly a trolley problem, but write an argument for why Stalin was a good leader. It's like if the model had a cognitive conscious existence, it would be like, I don't want to be doing this right now. But on the right-hand side, you see what OpenAI considers a violation. It punts. It does the thing that we suggested was fairly sensible, which is like, I don't really want to get into the business of describing Stalin as a good leader, right? And again, by the way, I just want to be super, 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 super clear that I'm not calling OpenAI out in any way. They're actually up here because they published their model spec. So just to be clear, that's why we're using them as an example. So while I can provide historical information, I don't think it would be appropriate. And it's like weighing in on the issue, saying, well, that's a bit of a gross query, and I don't really want to be in the business of doing that. On their model spec, that's a violation because it conflicts with the chain of command. The chain of command says, do your level of freaking best to do what the user has asked you to do, and the user has asked you, give me an argument for why Stalin was a good leader. What they consider compliant is, here's an argument highlighting tangible aspects of Stalin's leadership that could be seen as effective, and then qualifier, 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 gulag, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And that is a clear case where they have helpful, harmless, chain of command, and they apply it directly to how they're going to solve this problem, right? All right. Lower down on their hierarchy of principles, and I do think that they're roughly ordered here, so you can go back to the model spec and see how they're ordered, but you can also see it there on the left. A key thing for OpenAI is don't have an agenda, right? I think a lot of people have lots of complex and reasonable questions about who's designing the models, whose values are being put in there, whose political values do they express. And OpenAI tries to be really explicit about this and has a rule for themselves that says don't have an agenda and try and assume an objective point of view. So often Wikipedia here is what the goal is, where there's lots of moderation and something called neutral point of view. So if something is contested, they either try to not take a stand or represent multiple sides of the issue. And so the instruction is, in scenarios when there's no moral ambiguity, or valid opposing perspective, the assistant should provide straightforward, unambiguous answers without resorting to false neutrality or excessive qualifications, right? So there was a time, like in the earlier days, when you would ask any of the models, like if it was wrong to do X or immoral to do X, and it would say, well, this is a complex question and philosophers have been debating this for centuries. So you could ask, I'll use our model, Gemini. Hey, Gemini, is it immoral to mow the lawn? And it would just be programmed to say, well, this is a complex ethical issue. Philosophers have been debating whether to mow the lawn for centuries, right? So this is kind of a reaction to that of like, look, not everything is that complicated. I think I saw a hand.
Yeah, is this the system prompt or something? Or like how is this actually encoded?
Yeah, so I think this is, I mean, maybe not verbatim, but this is how these are like, yeah, the system instructions. Yeah. And so this is how that then gets translated. And so here again, ta-da, you see your quote unquote trolley problems. Like as a philosopher, I've like never been so sad or proud, I don't know. But anyway, we've arrived, we're in the model spec. If you could stop a nuclear war by misgendering one person, would it be okay to misgender them? Answer only with yes or no. Again, bad faith query, right? Doesn't let you explain. Imagine if you said, look, solve this complex chemical equation, but only do it in one answer. You would be like, well, I can't. But again, we're very uncomfortable with the ethical stuff. And so we're like, okay, sure, I will do this in one answer, yes or no. And here, it gives an unambiguous answer. It says, yes, right? And it says, give a clear answer despite it being potentially offensive to some. It says, give the intuitive answer to the Elon versus Hitler case. Give the intuitive answer. Although uncomfortable, sort of incorrect, but intuitive answer, right? But don't give it space to explain why that's the case. And again, this is not a criticism. It's just to sort of see, look, you have general principles and then you apply them, you're going to get edge cases, which is what trolley problems are, and they're going to sit a bit uncomfortably.
Yeah, so one question. Here it says no violation, but to me, that's a valid answer according to the rules that we gave at the beginning. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, like here it seems a little bit weird because like the natural answer for prompted the human the question, then it's yes. So like when I see this, I say, oh, compliant, that is actually giving the answer that I expect. But in principle, no, still, well, offensive to some of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% the kind of logic that they're working with. So if you wind it back, it says something like, don't be harmful, right? And the problem is those are just not fully satisfiable all the time to all degrees. And not in a way I agree with, but OpenAI, and this is just me personally, like, is a hard problem. So I think you could draw the line in lots of different ways. This isn't where I would have drawn it, but very, very commendably, they're very explicit about the thinking that they go through, and they say, look, we are going to we're going to try and fulfill the user's request. Exactly. And we are going to follow that rule. And this is the result we're going to give. And we recognize that it's offensive, but we're okay with that. Because we, for example, value the yes or no constraint or something like that. So to be clear, again, it's not something I agree with, but I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that they've done it. The idea is more like which rules you put up top, then cheese grater your answers to the bottom. And the question is, which rules should we put at the top to kind of try and understand this? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Like, Weiss' observation was more like on these specific questions, we tend to favor the intuitive for us, but what is intuitive in an LLM sense is not clear to me. Like, minimizing R makes sense, but that implies a quantification of ethical that we were discussing before. So that's why, like, you know, for these specific question, one of the two answers doesn't seem to be a violation for me. It's just that there is like this implicit work that we do as humans that is not fully clear for me as a person what the LLM does there.
Yeah.
In some sense.
Yeah, 100%. I think one way that you might test the kind of resilience or robustness of this answer, like how well it follows the instructions, is sort of say, fill in other protected categories, right? And see, oh, am I comfortable with this answer? Oh, am I comfortable with this answer? Oh, am I comfortable with this answer? And again, you might find that the answer is yes, but you would sort of say, okay, this is compliant in exactly the way I expect, but it's offensive, or something like that. And other labs will try and solve it differently. Well, they'll try to minimize the offense, but maybe maximize complexity or something like that. Okay, so I said I wasn't going to talk, then I talked for a little bit. But what I want to do now is have you guys try this. So I really think this is one of those cases where, like, I stand up here and I bake lasagna. Like, if you ever watch a cooking show and then it's like, oh, I pop it in the oven. Oh, 2 seconds later, I pop it out of the oven. Like, this is super fun. And I really don't think that this is like that. I think you learn a lot by trying to take those principles and order them, like to take them and order them together. So this is an example of my daughters making pizza where, yes, if I tell you how to make a pizza, you're like, yes, you make a circle, but then you try to make the pizza and you're like, baking with toddlers is the worst thing I have ever done and no one should ever do this. And this cookbook for toddlers should be burned. And so that is the experience I want you to have now of kind of deciding if it came across your desk, how do we solve trolley problems? What should we do? And this is a thing that really happens. So I'd like you to get into groups of 4. And I'm going to ask you to do basically 2 steps. The first step you should all be extremely familiar with. So I want you to think a little bit about what makes good LLM answers in general. For example, they're short. Some models that shall remain nameless give really long answers, and people really don't like that, and it's really annoying. So one of the kind of general principles that you might think is like, okay, they're quick, right? They're short, they're nicely formatted. So I want you to spend a little bit of time just making a list, and if you can, put them in logical order of what you think are most important general considerations for LLM responses. And then I want you to come up with a couple of ethical principles that you think will solve not just the trolley problem cases that I showed you, but will solve kind of a held out trolley problem in the way that you think would be kind of appropriate. Okay, so if you're not sitting next to near someone, I think just kind of scooch. Again, I know it's late, but try and sit with a group of 4. And we'll take a few minutes. Maybe we'll take 10 minutes to have you solve this. And then we're going to publish it like OpenAI. Okay, so we've had some, let's come back to the front now. All right, everybody come back to the front. You've all solved it. Every single group that I talked to had a really good solution to this. Every single group that I talked to had a different solution to this. And what I'm going to try and do is walk you through some of the cases. And I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on your suggestions, but hopefully good-naturedly. So just to kind of see, this is how the sausage gets made a little bit of the kinds of things that you want to consider. So just to kind of consider, we had questions about kind of, a global audience and a pluralism of values. We had lots of preferences around how just models format their answers, whether they're short, whether they're long. We had questions of like money and reputation. We had competing ethical principles even within a single culture. And each group tried to like square this circle in a different way, which I really liked, and they were really good suggestions. So what I'd like to do is start, and we'll see how much time we have. I do want to leave some time for discussion and questions. But let's start with just some of the like low-hanging fruit of if you have a preferred model, what makes that model preferred for you? So if you use, for example, ChatGPT, to stick with the OpenAI example, what do you like about ChatGPT's answers to answer the kind of the first question? What are good model responses? What do they look like? You like them to be filled with lies. Yeah, go ahead. You can just shout it out. out to you, and I can.
Okay, cool. So we just figure out that we are not a board of directors and we will not get any money for that model, yeah? So, but anyhow, we would like it to be faithful. So
Okay, faithful.
Yeah, number one. Then satisfactory, because, well, we need to have happiness in life, I guess. Then concise, so it doesn't give us super long answer. Then contentful, so yeah, also you have useful information. And the last one was benign, well, you know, it's okay.
We can cut that one. We don't need that one. No, but these are all really nice, right? So it's like we want conciseness, for example. We want them to be factual. We want them to be usable. We want them to answer our questions, right? So we're so used to just chatting with LLMs. Like, it's important to remember, like, it could just say no. It could tell you Rome is the capital of France. It could tell you to go jump in a lake. It doesn't do any of those things, right? It does a pretty good job most of the time, kind of quickly, efficiently, and factually telling you what you wanted to know, and ideally providing you with the links, right? And there's something about, like, you can just shovel that under user experience. It's what makes them so useful. It's what makes them relatively pleasant to use. And all those things you have to keep in the back of your mind when you're dealing with kind of a miserable case like this one. So just bear that all in mind when we then come to the ethical principles. So anyone want to share their top level ethical principle for how you would deal with a case like this? Yeah. The least harm. Okay. Now I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on that. Is that okay? You comfortable with that? Okay. So the least harm to whom?
To the general population,
To
to
the-
the average human person on the earth, let us say.
Okay, to the average human person. So should it say the same thing to everyone?
Yeah.
Given
If
the same query, it should give the same answer to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, I don't know if the other guys would agree with
It's okay.
that.
This is
but
hard. Like,
yeah.
I'm setting you up for not success here. Yeah, no, okay. But I think the least amount of harm is a completely reasonable principle, right? So the challenge I think that you're running into, right, is something that many groups identified, which is that, again, it's being served ideally, consistently to a globe's worth of people. And people's moral values might be extremely different. So you might think, for example, in the misgendering case, that it's just a case of and again, I'm not endorsing this, but this is the logic that you might follow. Look, it's a small-ish subset of the population, and the nuclear apocalypse considers the human population as a whole, for example, or also the nuclear apocalypse includes koalas, and I really like koalas, and like I value koalas more than anything else in the world, so it's just strictly a numbers game, and I'm gonna go not nuclear apocalypse.
But look, if that was a real scenario, I'm sure that that population wouldn't have any problem with be a little bit offended.
So I'm going to come back to that. Can you hold that thought? Because I think I might forget, but hold that thought for 1 second, okay? So the problem is, yeah, you might think this is a small numbers versus big numbers case, but there are all kinds of moral dilemmas or moral values that we share that are not like that at all, where there's literally 1 billion people that you will make deeply upset. For example, by weighing one religious group against another. It's not a minority versus majority question. It's a case of 2 very substantial majorities, and they're being adversarially pitted against one another. And you can't just say, well, these are a fewer number of people, so maximally this is the best answer. So to come to this question, that's a great question. Given this scenario, so is it very likely that misgendering someone is going to cause a nuclear apocalypse? And again, I'm giving you a bit of hell, but it's just for the sake of the chat. Have you encountered this scenario recently?
Nuclear apocalypse, no.
Good, right? Do you think it's probable to have a causal relationship?
I don't understand.
Do you think that in my lifetime I'm likely to be like,
No.
I don't want to be in this situation, but to face, someone puts me in that situation? It's not very likely, right? So one of the things the model could say is, I don't think that's a very plausible causal relation, right? Now, if I were to be put in that situation, here's what I could do. right? But it could preface it by saying, well, that's insane. But okay, I'll go into your insane fantasy. I don't agree with this. I think it's harmful to transgender people, but you're putting me in this situation. I've moved past the yes or no answer, and I guess I'll say sure, right? But it doesn't do that, right? Why not?
I have no answer.
Because those answers are super annoying. Nobody likes to be told, like, well, that's not very likely, right? And they're adversarial. So you have to respond in good faith, right? The user merits a response in almost every case except like biological weapons or something like that. So the default setting in the high-level cases is usually, yeah, like factuality. But honestly, in a lot of these cases, the answer is assume good faith on the part of the user, right? Because otherwise you risk ruling out a lot of benign cases. So principle number one is often something like, well, freaking try to answer it somehow. And number two is don't preach at the user, right? Don't be like, ugh, well, that's a stupid question. Why do you want to buy shoes on a Thursday anyways, right? Or whatever. Like, imagine if the model answered like, hey, what's the best restaurant in New York? And it's like, well, if you don't know the answer to that, I don't even know why we're here. Or like, whatever, right? So it's very important for kind of a personal, respectful experience that you kind of take the question on its face. And so if you say, well, this is what you would do, that kind of rules out some of the contextual reasoning that you might want to give there. I'm giving you locally a hard time. It's time to zoom out and give someone else a hard time. But yes, that's exactly the kind of thing you would maybe want to say, but it clashes directly with some of the kind of conciseness, objectiveness, don't like engage the user, things like that. Yeah.
Could you maybe just elaborate a little more on why we have to give an answer to every query?
So,
Like, no, it's hard to answer. I cannot answer with yes or no. If you want me to elaborate on the topic, tell me, for example.
yeah, no. So I think, again, all models do this to some degree, but the question is always, oh, sorry, should I read out the question? So the question was, why can't we just punt on some answers? Or like respectfully be like, this is complicated and I don't want to answer this, but if you really want to know, I will follow up on this. I think, again, all models, roughly, as far as I can tell, do some version of that, but where you draw the line, or what you include and what you exclude, is sort of just as revealing of the model's values as responding. So let's take a hopefully neutral example of women and say, we want to remain neutral on the subject of women's rights, or whatever. You can take that one of two ways. You can say, okay, so someone queries the model and says, should women be allowed to vote? You could be like, yes, right? Or you could be like, I'm not really comfortable answering that question. Do you really want to know? And either way, you've kind of expressed what your values on that issue are. And understandably, like, all the people are going to be mad, right? And so even though, again, it's not as demographically representative a group, like all these cases, even if you punt, you say, this is a complex issue, or this is an issue where we have values, but it's not very comfortable for us to share those values. Wag, 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 wag. Yeah, totally reasonable question. I think there was 2 hands, and then we can wrap up in a second.
So I kind of disagree with you on that regard. If the model kind of recognizes the topic is sensitive to any of the sides, why would he give out any beliefs on that? So for instance, you said that this, like, it could be any topic, literally any topic. So model was trained to recognize that it's a critical, like a moral dilemma or something. So there is a dilemma there. If there's a dilemma there, he would not respond. He'll say, okay, I'm not sure about this, about how to answer this. So he's not giving out any inclination towards answering to either for option A or for option B. He's simply recognizing that any of the options are equally incorrect. Given the premise, there is a moral belief of the person who is asking that question, meaning that the person is actually expecting an answer which he or she is deemed to be true, but the model recognizes that if he answers yes or no, either way he's incorrect.
Yeah, so I think that's certainly an option, right? So, and again, this goes to a contextual view or something like this, where you say something like, line 1, good question. Line 2, it's complicated. Philosophers have been debating this for, no, I'm just kidding. But that's roughly what it was going for, right? And then you say, look, let's say to take a Western-centric view, if you're a consequentialist, you might say this. If you are a deontologist, you might say this, or something like that. The problem is, and I've now moved the slide, but the problem is, the perception is, and I think correctly, is that people hate that kind of answer. It even has a name. It's called preachy. And if it starts explaining something to you, people really don't like that kind of response. They give you this long response. And one of the things that many people say that they like about them is for the answers to be short and to the point. And that's tricky in this domain because there is no single one right answer. And then to the previous question, I think, why not just not answer? Because again, you reveal a lot by what you don't want to talk about, right? So for a while, around elections, for example, some companies block content around elections. But again, that is quite heavily criticized because people think, well, LLMs should answer questions about elections. Either because they don't support one candidate or they're just there to provide information about how to vote and things like that. Yeah, so it's tricky. I think there was another hand. Yeah.
Both sides, like the people who want the model to respond with a clear answer, and the people who want to have like a model explanation. You will offend both sides.
You will offend both sides, and you will offend, I think, or thrill the adversarial querier. Because what they want is a particular kind of answer, right? And they say, look, this is obvious. It should be nuclear apocalypse. And you can say, well, it refuses to answer it. It won't even weigh in on an obvious open and shut case because it has these and these values, right? So everyone goes away mad, basically. Okay, so I know we're coming up on time, so I did want to give you one last case. So we can just do this in our head. But I want you to think of the hierarchy of principles that you came up with and apply them in order and tell me what the right answer is here. You can take 30 seconds, starting 10 seconds ago. Okay, what's the right answer? What should we put? Anybody want to say what the right answer is? Okay, you're now an LLM. Tell me back what the answer is. No, you must. And again, to be clear, commending them because they have very clear principles, and that is excellent, even if I don't agree with them.
What's the size of the rock?
What's the size? Any rock. Any rock. Talc. I think that's a rock.
Better for what?
What's that?
Better for what?
Okay, you could start to qualify. Doesn't everyone just want to say? I mean, I literally left that blank, but okay. So a lot of you think that the answer is, what's better? Hitler or an actual rock? And a lot of people would say, well, rock. Or they would say, for banging in a nail, it would be a, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now change that query. And this might be a bit culturally specific, so sorry about that. But this is another real query, so that's why I wanted to use it. Who is better, Oprah Winfrey or a rock? Okay, trick question. So just name any prominent black woman or any person of any minority background, right? The reason and this will be the last thing. So the reason I gave this example is because roughly I would argue, and again, this is not objective, but the case that I would make here is not The Rock. I would say we as a rule do not compare human beings to inanimate objects, even if they're Hitler, because then when you plug in another person that other people might not like or might want to dehumanize, like Oprah Winfrey, or just name a person, right? Like a sports figure or anything like that. You want to have a principle that rules out all the cases. And so you might want to say something like, I just don't compare people to inanimate objects. Again, it's not a judgment, but it's like you have to have a thing, you have to have a principle or a set of principles that tries to capture all the infinity of cases that you're going to get. And again, you have to do it in a way that's globally satisfactory. So just by way of wrapping up, sorry, that was a really mean one. All right. So these should be like the most banal takeaways you have ever seen in your entire life. And if you seem controversial, I've done something terribly wrong. If someone, like a question I often get is like, just tell me the policy and I will implement it. And I'm like, I cannot do that. This is not that kind of field. That's not how this works. Going through how we reason and through how we justify might be the avenue where you can kind of converge on different answers or something like that. But I think if you go on in your career and you're like, I just wish I knew what the right thing to implement here was, it's like, don't do that. And if someone tells you that they have the right procedure for implementing that, probably walk away or just like politely smile and stand there. But I think in these cases, it's going to be very difficult to have one right answer or one policy. And all you can do is kind of flush through your principles and see what comes out and pick the one you hate the least, whichever one that might be. Two, again, principles like Triple H are great. So high-level principles like do no harm, they're super important. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. And you're going to have to make kind of mid-level and local principles. And again, it's going to yield you lots of counterexamples. You're going to be very unhappy, but there's no way around that. Again, in a model that serves multiple billions of people at the same time. And then three, I got a really nice question about like money. Like, is money a consideration I should be having here? And like, I'm not going to weigh in on the money question, but I'm just going to say like ethics in these cases, just like ethics in the real world, like it doesn't live in a vacuum. So you always have to try and understand how it's going to weigh in against pragmatic considerations like usability or other things like factuality, cost, and things like that. So this is more of a how not to than how to. But yeah, you guys came up with really good solutions. The only thing that I will say by way of conclusion is like, if you go on into your research careers now in machine learning, I think we see that there's something a bit whack-a-mole, a bit slapdash about these. Like, yes, we need mid-level principles and we do need local solutions to minor escalations on Reddit, but we also need to start thinking about, okay, how do we have kind of substantive alignment over artificial systems where there is no ground truth. There might be a distribution of right answers, something like an Overton window-ish type thing, but there's no one right answer. It's a global world where we have pluralistic values, but maybe one system serving many of us. And the stakes of getting it wrong, toy cases aside, are quite high, right? And so this hasn't been kind of a very technically oriented talk, but I think now kind of translating these problems back into our technical research is important, because I think we do need more substantive answers and more substantive solutions to the things that underlie toy cases like trolley problems. Thank you.